This is James Colvin, who was born on the 12th of August 1873. His parents were Daniel Colvin and Margaret MacNee. He married Jane MacNee on the 1st of April 1907. Jane's parents were listed as Patrick MacNee and Mary Woods. The celebrant was the brother of the groom, Daniel Colvin, while the witnesses were Thomas Colvin, his brother, and Catherine MacNee, who was probably Jane's sister. Jane MacNee was born on Friday the 25th of March in 1881. Her father was listed as Patrick MacNee, coal miner, and her mother was Mary MacNee, maiden name Woods, Mary Woods. They were both married on the 7th of October 1878 in the Shettleston parish. They lived at the time at 36 Mary Row in the village of Stonefield in the parish of Blantyre. On Friday, March the 5th, 1909, James and Jane welcomed to the world their daughter, Mary Wood Colvin, who was born at 2:40 a.m. They lived at 295 Main Street, Shettleston. James Colvin had the profession of iron moulder. On the 21st of May 1910, the SS Caledonia sailed from Glasgow in Scotland and arrived in New York on the 29th of May 1910. On board the SS Caledonia was James Colvin, aged 29, his wife Jane Colvin, aged 26, and their child Mary Woods Colvin, who was just over 1 year old. The address of the nearest relative on the manifesto was Daniel Colvin, the father. Some interesting information from the manifesto was a question asking whether they were going to join a relative or friend, and if so, what relative or friend, and their name and complete address. The person they nominated was Catherine MacNee, who had arrived there earlier in 1908, who happened to be the sister of Jane. She lived at 14 Valley View Street, Oneonta in New York. A little bit of exploration about Catherine MacNee shows that on the 13th census of the United States in 1910, she appears as a boarder at number 14 Valley View Street in Oneonta City in New York. She's listed as a boarder, 29 years old, female. She works in a silk mill, and the address coincides that when James Colvin and his wife Jane arrived in New York, that was the address they were staying at, or they put down to stay with. So Catherine MacNee, for some reason, being a single girl, she went to New York in 1908 to live, and actually she returned to Scotland because in 1922 she again is found on a manifesto from a boat from Glasgow back to New York. So I'm not too sure what the circumstances or reason for doing this. We can only guess, but the facts are the facts. And yeah, so she emigrated in 1908 from Glasgow, Scotland to New York, and she returned back to the Glasgow around 1922, because in 1922 she returned back to New York. Sometime in early 1912, Daniel Colvin was born, Daniel Joseph Colvin. I don't have a birth certificate as of yet, so that's one thing I'm looking forward to obtaining. Anyway, going back, so Mary and Daniel were the two kids of James and Jane. Something happened. Whatever it is, still not too sure. Not too sure what it is, but it must have been something bad enough for the two kids to be sent back home to Glasgow. My research showed that both Daniel Joseph Colvin and Mary Woods Colvin were both sent back to Glasgow in September 1913. They departed from Boston and they arrived at Glasgow in September. They were on the Allen Line, the steamship Allen Line. The boat's name was the Parisian, which we have a picture of here. The Parisian was launched on November 4th, 1880, and her maiden voyage was from Liverpool to Halifax in Boston on March the 10th, 1881. She was built at Glasgow by Robert Napier and Sons and was owned by the Allen Line from Liverpool in England. She was 440 feet long and 46 feet wide with a depth of 25 foot. The Parisian, on April the 15th and 16th in 1912, just as a little bit of a side note, the Parisian took part in the search for victims after the ill-fated steamship Titanic struck an iceberg and sank. She arrived at Halifax on April 17th, 1912 with the news that she had not found any survivors from the Titanic. By 1914 she was out of service and sold to some Italian shipbreakers. So now we come to the postcard. There was a picture sent by James Colvin to his sister, which I assume would have been Sarah Rogan. Took me a while to interpret the postcard. I had to go through a genealogy site to get it interpreted, and eventually we did get it interpreted, and this is what he wrote. Dear sister, I don't think you have to look for father's photo when you see this. I think it makes me look old, and you know I don't want to. Love to Mary and Daniel. With love, James. The sadness of this picture is that he went to a studio with a photo of his two kids and got a picture taken of him looking at a picture of his two kids. I don't know if this picture was taken shortly after they left, or if this was taken many years later. There's no indication to when it was. So so that's the sadness I see in this picture. Just to finish off the story of James Colvin and Jane MacNee, the next time we see any of them is in 1936, when Daniel Joseph Colvin married Elizabeth McGuinness at St Bride's Chapel at Cambuslang on the 13th of July 1936. He was aged 24, Elizabeth was aged 22. The witnesses were Vincent Coyle and Mary McGuinness, most likely the sister. Vincent Coyle is an interesting one that I'll mention a little bit later. James Colvin, the father, who was an iron moulder, he was listed as deceased. Jane Colvin, maiden name MacNee, was also marked as deceased. James Elizabeth McGuinness's parents was James McGuinness. He was a coal miner, still alive, and her mum was Elizabeth McGuinness, maiden name Clark. They were married by James Lillis, and that's all. Daniel Colvin was listed as a general labourer and a bachelor, and Elizabeth McGuinness was listed as a domestic servant and a spinster. Daniel came from 958 Tollcross Road, Shettleston. Of Mary Woods Colvin, little is known. All I know at the moment is that she went back with Daniel back to Shettleston, and she was living with her aunt, Sarah Rogan, and other than that, not much is known about what happened to Mary Woods Colvin. Probably we'll have to wait until the 1921 census, which will be out either next year in 2021 or the following year in 2022. So until we get those census records, little is known. She seems to have vanished off the face of the earth. Going back to Daniel Joseph Colvin's wedding back in 1936, one of the witnesses was by the name of Vincent Coyle. I'm not too sure who Vincent is, except to suggest that there was one of James Colvin's sister was Margaret Hendry Colvin. She married a William Coyle in 1897. Unfortunately, she died in childbirth in 1900. So I'm just wondering if maybe Vincent is related to William Coyle's family. Tragically, Daniel Joseph Colvin was killed in an accident on the 30th of April 1957 at the Ravenscraig Steelworks. Daniel's death certificate stated that he was a steel erector and that he was married to Elizabeth McGuinness. He died at 2 p.m. on the 30th of April 1957 at the Ravenscraig Steelworks. He was 45 years old. His father was James Colvin, who was an iron moulder, deceased. His mum was Jane Colvin, maiden name MacNee, deceased. He died of multiple injuries as a result of a fall from a height. He was seen after death by an Oliver Gray. The informant was James McGuinness, who was his brother-in-law, who lived at Hillview Crescent in Cumberslang. The death was registered on the 1st of May 1957. An inquiry was held into his death, of which the result of the inquiry was that multiple injuries result of fall from height. Deceased received injuries in course of his employment through falling from a staging on a gas holder a distance of approximately 80 feet. He died as a result of the said injuries. The verdict of the jury. The date of this inquiry was the 27th of June 1957. I did some research and found out that Ravenscraig is an area of land located in Motherwell, North Lancashire in Scotland. Ravenscraig was formerly the site of the steelworks, once the largest hot strip steel mill in Western Europe, but the steelworks closed in 1992 and is now almost totally demolished. And above is a picture of the steelworks. This is the conclusion of the current information I have regarding James Colvin, Jane MacNee, his wife, Mary Woods Colvin, their daughter, and Daniel Joseph Colvin, their son. Following are the family trees of Daniel Joseph Colvin and Mary Woods Colvin in perspective to the Colvin family, and also in perspective to the MacNee family. Thank you for your attention. That's my dog, Mila.